Hi everyone, thank you for joining us at this IIRSM Scotland branch webinar. Welcome from me, Vicky Cutler, the chair of the Scotland branch committee. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker for today, Matt Dawes, who's going to be talking about the HSE's duty to manage asbestos campaign and asbestos management plans in general. Matt is an asbestos specialist, having over 20 years experience within the asbestos industry. I'm not going to steal his thunder, and I'm going to let him tell you all about his knowledge, experience, and in asbestos across industries. Um, he's happy to take questions. If you could use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to add your questions, and what we'll do is we'll pick all of those up at the end of the session and have a general discussion and answer those questions for you. Thanks again for joining us. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much. As Vicky said, good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by introducing myself. I am Matt Dawes. I have worked in the asbestos industry since 2003, so over 20 years, as Vicky said. I also had a 3-year period where I worked on the client side. All of my experience is vocational. So I've been a practicing air tester, analyst, surveyor, technical manager, training manager, and I am a certified competent person for asbestos, holding the certificate of competence, which is from the BOHS. And for 4 years, I sat on the board of directors for the United Kingdom Asbestos Training Association. And the session that we've put together this afternoon is really looking at what's happening with the campaign from the HSE, but also why that seems to have sort of come about and what that actually is going to be looking for from an asbestos management point of view and what asbestos management plans look like. It is just a short duration session. Shouldn't last any longer than an hour, and that includes the QA. So all that being said, we'll make a start on the slide. So the content of what this is going to cover is looking at the campaign, which was launched in January of 2024 by the Health and Safety Executive. And I think at the moment it's kind of just sitting there, making people aware, encouraging people to look into it before they actually start sort of engaging, perhaps a little bit closer later in the year. Asbestos surveys, risk assessments, asbestos management plans, what they all look like and the importance of them. And as I say, at the very end, we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So the idea of the campaign that has launched in January of 2024 essentially is to bring people a greater understanding of how asbestos management is expected to look. And that there's sort of reasons as to where this has kind of developed from. I think the original control of asbestos at work regulations in 2002 introduced the duty to manage asbestos. So they gave people 2 years to achieve compliance, and that was from 2004. We're now 20 years on, so it's a good time. But also, as we'll see in a few slides' time, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 5 years or so in relation to the way asbestos management in the UK is dealt with, and it culminated in 2023 with the Health and Safety Executive recruiting a technical lead for asbestos, which is part of what that job advertisement is there. And as opposed to historic degree level qualifications, they actually recruited from industry, which to me suggests that there is a greater interest in people with practical experience of asbestos management as opposed to the theoretical side, which has historically been sort of floating around. The web pages have been completely revised from January. Historically, in my opinion, the pages were a little bit tired, I suppose is the best way. It's all very, very good now. It's very intuitive. The website there will take you to the splash screen that you can see on the extract from the screen dump there. And it goes through the sort of 8 steps, and then there's a 9th sort of page which explains case studies on how asbestos management can be achieved. But it's all quite nicely laid out. There's lots of videos, there's lots of interaction, there's lots of reference documents as well, such as example registers and example asbestos management plans, which are again, in my opinion, far better than they ever have been. And that's why sort of the trigger point for generating this session was something I was keen to get involved with, is to inform people on how asbestos management um, should look. It doesn't need to be a massively complicated and convoluted process, but if we follow this sequence as detailed on there, you're going to be in a stronger position than not. There's a little arrow that I've popped there because, in my experience, both as a consultant and as somebody that deals with external audits, the step 5 of creating an asbestos register and completing the risk assessment is something that sometimes gets overlooked. So we go almost straight from point 4, we've got a survey, to point 6, we've got our asbestos management plan. And we sort of often see that people haven't taken that middle step of creating the workable document and completing the risk assessment. I suppose thinking about why in 2024 it's really being pushed when the legislation has existed since 2002. And there's been various different campaigns, focus groups, think tanks, reports. I could have filled this page with copious amounts of them. And it really started way back in 2019, where we had Respublica that created this Airtight on Asbestos campaign. And that was kind of the first real straw that was added in terms of what was viewed to be the UK's approach to asbestos management. And then there's been various campaigns. There was the first annual report in 2022, which was a combination of various key industry stakeholders, and that highlighted that a lot of asbestos in UK buildings has some degree of damage. There was a select committee hearing where parliamentary group wanted to look at how health and the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, approached asbestos management, and that kind of progressed between 20, I think it was around 2020, 2021, 2022. And there was a white paper that was subsequently published, which ended up with the wider parliamentary committee. And then back 12 months ago, there was another sort of open forum where it was again discussed. So there's been the sort of crux of it is there's a lot of discussions that have taken place around asbestos management in the UK. There's various white papers that I really haven't got enough time to go into on a 60-minute webinar, but they are all freely available off the internet. And the parliamentary select committee hearing as well, they had some very key speakers there, including the chief executive from the health and safety executive and various industry stakeholders. So that's the reason that we've seen that there's an evolution, and the revised duty to manage campaign, which is now called Asbestos Your Duty, that's taking place within the health and safety executive. But it's not just the HSE that have engagement with asbestos management, and this was a case from prosecuted in 2022. So Poundland were fined £500,000 for failing in their asbestos management approach, and that was brought from local authority, brought from the council, who essentially looked at the way that asbestos management had been dealt with over the last 10 years. In one particular store, they weren't happy with what had been done. They didn't have proper management plan, and this is the sentence there on the sort of 5th paragraph down, is that Poundland did not have a proper asbestos management plan, linked into what we're talking about today. And then therefore there was a question posed, and the answer that was given was, we do not know. We don't have the answer to that question. And that's never something you want to be saying to local authorities who are concerned about asbestos exposures. So yeah, that's the reason why that we're talking about asbestos so much, perhaps more so than we perhaps have done for recent years. Now, I talk about asbestos management as being joined up, and I talk a lot about how, for me, we should think about asbestos management, about risk management, and think of it in terms of a dot to dot. So if we don't join them up correctly, we end up in a situation that sometimes can lead to failings. This is a very, very basic sort of flow chart that I just popped together. And if we start our asbestos management journey by identifying the asbestos, so arranging the surveys, I've got a very brief slide on what that looks like because that's going to tell us where the asbestos is in our buildings. But the survey itself is a snapshot in time, and we need to actually be able to revise and review and manipulate, adjust, and risk score. And that's where the asbestos register comes in. The asbestos register, it doesn't need to be anything more complicated than an Excel spreadsheet, depending on the volume of properties that you have asbestos management responsibilities for. But the point of the asbestos register is that it gives us the capacity to amend our risk assessments, to complete our risk assessments. The survey is essentially thinking of something as a snapshot in time, which doesn't really change, but the register is the most up-to-date information, and that will be almost in a constant state of evolution, dependent on how often your building use, occupation, etc. changes. And as part of that asbestos register, we complete our risk assessments, and that's when we look at the exposure of people to asbestos, because in terms of asbestos as a risk, if there are no people that can be exposed to the asbestos, then the asbestos is not a risk, it's a hazard. And I think that's the step that I was referring to, where people sometimes overlook it and therefore rely on the data set that's provided in the initial step, which is the asbestos survey, which then leads to people trying to manage asbestos based on hazard. But once we've created our risk assessment and once we've populated our asbestos register, we can then look at creating our asbestos management plan. And this is where, for me, it's important to consider each one of those processes before we get to writing the asbestos management plan. Because if we don't know what our risks are from asbestos, how do we write a plan to manage those risks? And I refer to it as a house of cards because organizations that have created a management plan without risk assessments have arbitrary timescales, and there's no logic behind what we're trying to actually manage. And hopefully this will give you a little bit of clarity on the basics that surround that today. So starting off with the very beginning, asbestos surveying. Asbestos surveying has to be carried out in accordance with the guidance. It's strongly recommended by the health and safety executive that organisations use UCAS accredited organisations. At this moment in time, that is not a legal requirement. It's a strong recommendation. I suspect that when regulations get revised, whenever that will be, whether that's next year or the year after, that it will become a legal requirement. That's just a suspicion. I've got nothing hard and fast to go off that. But I do think that the sort of the questions that are being asked of clients are indicative that may be. And it's interesting because finding the asbestos at this moment in time is the only aspect of consultancy that isn't mandated to be UCAS accredited. So analysis of samples has to be done by accredited organisations. Analysis of air tests has to be done by accredited organisations. But actually finding the asbestos in the first place doesn't. The client, this document, when it was published in 2010, wasn't any longer only aimed at people that do surveys. It was also inclusive of the client, and it contains a lot of information in there that the client really should consider when requesting surveys. This is free to download from the HSE's website as well, or you can purchase a copy. And it also talks about how the information included in the asbestos survey should be able to be extracted to generate our asbestos register. Without wanting to repeat myself, it's sequential. A follows B follows, B follows A, etc. So the asbestos survey, as detailed in HSG 264, will generally contain the material assessment algorithm or the material risk algorithm, which is detailed within another health and safety guidance document, HSG 227. Now, the material assessment tells us the hazard of a product, and that is really only going to include or going to detail the potential for asbestos fibres to be released into the air. It has very little bearing on the potential for somebody to be exposed to those fibres. because you can have hundreds of millions of fibers released into the air with nobody around. Well, nobody's there to breathe them in. So you can see the two examples that I've kind of mocked up on the right hand side there to indicate how this can perhaps mislead people. So we've got insulation debris and a redundant duct, which the numbers there, sorry, the statements there are really just tied to those numbers, but it scores 12 out of 12 in terms of the hazard it presents. If we compare that to the item underneath it, which is insulating board on a corridor, that scores 6 out of 12. So what that's telling us is that the insulation debris in the duct has a greater potential to release fibres into the air than the board on the corridor. And this is generally what most asbestos surveys are going to tell you. The part that is often missing from the risk assessment process is the second part, which is the priority risk. Again, detailed in 227. And this looks at the potential for people to be exposed, looking at what people are doing in the area, the amount of people that are in there and how long they're in there for, what sort of maintenance is carried out. And if you think about the details required here, it's something that a lot of the time the asbestos surveyor is unlikely to have access to the information to be able to achieve correct scoring. So it's really the responsibility of the duty holder, of the person with asbestos responsibility. And it can be quite convoluted, but again, the reasons behind using something like an Excel register, Excel spreadsheet, means that it can be rapidly populated. But using the example from previous, we initially noted that the debris in the duct scores 12 and the door scores 6. So running the priority assessment algorithm, which again is human exposure potential, we can see that this time the duct scores a 2 in total, as opposed to the board on the door in the corridor, which scores a 9 in total. And those two algorithms, when added together, give us an indicator as to the risk. So we add the material assessment to the priority assessment, that gives us our risk assessment. And it takes us to a point, but we'll also need to have an action plan, and we'd have to have almost an itemized action plan as to why certain decisions are being made with certain items. You can achieve the same score, but might have different actions dependent on the business, the location, etc., etc. But this is the starting point, if you like. And the reason we're in the position we are in 2024, where a lot of organizations aren't effectively managing asbestos, is because we've missed this step out. We've created the management plan, but it's based on simply what the surveys have told us and the opinion of the surveyor, which again is not set in stone. Two surveyors will have two different opinions. So from my sort of perspective, clients should be consistent in their approach. So that then tells us how we can deal with it. And once we've established this, we can write our plan. And there's a very good excerpt on that HSE website that details in good detail, albeit brief, on how this looks for various organizations, because again, multi-site, multi-building organizations compared to a single site, single occupancy building are going to have different issues, and different details and longevity, longness, if you like, length, that's the word I was looking for the management plan. So what are we trying to achieve when we create our asbestos management plan? The key thing where we try and manage asbestos, it really boils down to prevention of exposure. And that's exposure to individuals, that's exposure to workers, visitors, and anybody else who may have exposure issues from accessing our buildings. We need to be able to control the works that are taking place, highlight any remediation requirements, and raise awareness. Those second 3 points, 2, 3, and 4, are almost answer to the first point, because by controlling workers, we're preventing exposure. By highlighting any remediation that's required on our buildings, we're going to be preventing exposure. And by raising people's awareness and having asbestos as a topic that's perhaps not whispered about in darkened corridors, we're going to prevent people from being exposed. And ultimately, asbestos affects people and asbestos kills people as a result of being exposed to it. It doesn't kill people simply because it's in another country. People have to be involved with it. So, moving on from that is how do we then consider what we're going to include in our management plan? And I've taken this from how management plans I've written have kind of evolved over the years. Um, a management plan, which is 55 pages long, for an organisation that only has 3 items of asbestos on their site, is probably not going to be fit for purpose. So again, the larger the organisation, the more complicated the properties, the different types of asbestos, this will have an impact on the length and breadth of the asbestos management plan. But loosely speaking, starting off in section, and I'm going to go through each one of these sections over the next sort of 15, 20 minutes or so. So the introduction, aims and objectives of the management plan should be detailed. The roles and responsibilities that this management plan impacts on. So essentially from the chief executive, the CEO, the MD, all the way down to external contractors and where their responsibilities lie, that should all be detailed. Whose responsibility is it to keep this plan up to date? Whose responsibility is it? Information regarding record keeping, how that information is going to be accessed, where it's stored, how detailed is it? Because again, the surveys contain information that won't necessarily be extrapolated into the asbestos register. So understanding those, the action plan, the process maps, the scoring, what does score 24 mean to us? How we're going to control work on the premises or the multiple premises, the communication of information, how that information is going to be shared with internal and external stakeholders. And finally, we talk about emergency procedures because despite all of this plan, things will still go wrong. So how is that going to look with our organisation? Again, one size does not fit all with emergency procedures. So let's look at them. Introduction, aims and objectives. Concise, brief. There's nothing worse for me than 15 pages of introductions and aims. I've lost interest. So it should really detail the policy, the extent of the reach. So is this a overarching global management plan for an organisation, or is it a site-specific asbestos management plan? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides' time, because the two do work together, overarching organisational wide, but also every site is different. You've got different regions, etc. So a summary of the legislation should be included as well. And obviously, as things evolve, legislation changes. So that's an important point about keeping that up to date. So that's the sort of summary on how that would look. Hierarchy, this was just a sort of example of authority versus responsibility. But the duty holder is generally the figurehead of an organization. And they are the accountable person, albeit not necessarily the responsible person, because they can delegate that responsibility. Who's got a deputisation? Because if the responsible person isn't available for holidays or sickness, then does asbestos management cease? And it should never do that. Managers, what accountability and responsibility are managers going to have, whether that's middle or lower level management? The workforce, a lot of the times you'll see that the workforce responsibilities in an organizational hierarchy, it almost directly correlates to the requirements of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is look after yourselves and follow the instructions. Any contractors, what are their responsibilities? How do they impact on the asbestos management plan? And again, that might even be split into general contractors carrying out building maintenance and asbestos specific contractors, such as your consultants who carry out air monitoring and surveying, and the removal contractors, remediation contractors who carry out the remediation and repair work. So the asbestos plan should really detail who is responsible for what within an organisation. Asbestos record keeping. So where are we going to keep those records? How are we going to access them? detail whose responsibility it is for making sure that those records are accurate. Because if we've got a constant flow of information coming into an organization, then that's a constant stream of record updating. And then how are we going to consider getting information to the contractors? And again, there's lots of different ways that we can go about doing that. You'll see it on the screen there. I've popped a QR code. More and more we're seeing QR codes utilized for direct access to information, sometimes behind a sort of secure, what I would call a paywall, if you like. So you have to have a username and password. That in itself creates an audit trail, which is able to see that contractors have looked at these things. But having those records in a controlled environment, making sure that people can access them, but also making sure that the records aren't so convoluted as to be ambiguous, I suppose is the best way of putting it. Reams and reams of information that takes a sort of master's degree to be able to interpret is not going to be much benefit to most settings. The information should be usable. And this, I would also, in my ideal world scenario, like to see a link to be able to get the original asbestos survey data from this location as well, because I think that is always something that I would like to be able to reference. So details then, following on from how to get the information, what is the action plan? What is the, for want of a better way, what is the RAG rating that we're going to use when it comes to asbestos management? What's the trigger point? What triggers removal? What triggers repair? What triggers us doing re-inspections? Again, the re-inspection of asbestos detailed there. How often do we need to re-inspect it? We seem to have somehow evolved into this annual re-inspection scenario in the UK, and consultants themselves will recommend annual re-inspections. But why? And this is, for me, is one of those things that why do we annually re-inspect? When if you actually read the approved code of practice, it says condition inspected periodically, and that frequency depends on our risk assessment. An easy way for me to validate management plans or to sort of determine whether they're going to be any use is to look at this frequency of inspection. If you've got something that's in a high traffic area that's disturbed frequently by hundreds of people, annually is not going to be anywhere near adequate in terms of inspection. Remember what we're trying to achieve, prevent people from being exposed. And that's where these re-inspections, and likewise, if you have, say, a damp-proof course that's largely inaccessible, why are we re-inspecting it annually? When in reality, the likelihood of it getting disturbed, it's unlikely to ever happen unless we're actually doing construction work. And these are things that it's almost like intuitive asbestos management as opposed to, oh, we'll just make up some timescales. So what are we looking for when we do re-inspections? Deterioration. And that's what it is. Again, if it's in a high traffic area, the likelihood of deterioration through human interaction is far greater than, for argument's sake, a tank in a loft that nobody ever goes in the loft. And then we talk about re-inspections quite a lot as consultants and competence. What do we need to be able to demonstrate to re-inspect an asbestos? Again, there's always to it, but essentially we're looking for signs of deterioration. There's not a sort of formal qualification out there that says that makes you competent. Now, information, instruction, training, knowledge, experience, these are all variables. But being able to differentiate between something that wasn't damaged a year ago, or 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, that has now got a hole in it, that should be suitable and sufficient. Again, within reason. Control of works, control of contractors. What information are we expecting any external contractors to be bringing to site with them? Are we expecting them to hold the survey on site? I would. If I was carrying out an audit on a contractor that was doing a kitchen replacement, I would expect her to have the information there available on site. Following on from that, if we're having asbestos remediation works, how are we going to issue that? Are there limitations to what we will permit? Or are we just going to have a blanket approach where all work with asbestos, whether it falls within the confines of the permissioning regime, licensing regime or not? I'm talking in the UK. Are we just going to use a licensed contractor for all works? That's something that could be detailed here. The important thing with this is don't put yourself out to dry by stating something in this document and then not doing it. And I see that a lot as well, where people will state, we'll use a licensed contractor for all works, we'll use a UCAS accredited company for all surveys, and then I'll check the survey reports and they're non-UCAS accredited, or we'll see that Steve the builder's removed some floor tiles. It's very easy in that scenario to non-conform. Um, Training expectations. So what are the expectations for training? Are we going to go down the route of just blanket approach? Everybody does asbestos awareness training virtually or via e-learning, or are we going to put benchmarks against standards in much the same way as organizations that detail UCAS accreditation or licensed contractors? There are certification organizations, approval bodies, if you will, that will benchmark asbestos training. Examples include UCARTA, which I mentioned on the first slide, IATP, British Occupational Hygiene Society or BOHS. So there are benchmarking organizations out there that at least give clients faith that training is delivered to a set standard. Communication of information, making sure that any site that has impact, that is impacted from asbestos management plans, can access it and know what it says. Telling the staff what the arrangements are and what to do in an emergency or an incident. How are we going to get the information to the emergency services in the event of an incident or the event of them requiring it? Providing information on the asbestos management plan to anybody else that has requirements, such as trade union representatives or employee representatives. And excuse me. And there's a point at the bottom there, which is something that I find myself discussing more and more, even in my own head as time goes by. And that is, does every site or every premise within our organization require an individual management plan? And I think if you'd have spoken to me 5 years ago, I would have said no, organizational management plans should detail everything. But the more I'm doing works with clients, I'm realizing the benefit of having that global management plan. But every site is going to be subject to its nuances, to the site specifics. So for me, the more I sort of detail it, the more I'm inclined to say, I think every site should have its own asbestos management plan. Now, if we can capture the vast majority of site specific, not site specific, sorry, the vast majority of general in a global management plan, then the management plan for a site specific may only be 2 to 3 pages, may even be 1 page. But I think it's important that we consider the risks that every site has. Is one site, for example, more prone to vandalism, or is it on the thoroughfare from a city centre where people are liable to throw bricks on their way out of town, etc. These are all variables. Also, what are the people that are in that premise like, and what's the potential for asbestos to be damaged by the general occupancy? So I think, as I say, I'm more inclined now to sort of discuss with clients about site specifics. And the last bit really is looking at emergency procedures. And in my opinion and experience, we can express this as a flowchart, as an appendix, but it's important that people are aware of what to do. So the picture that you can just see dipping into the screen there, this is actually from a real life scenario that was presented to me, where a person that I delivered some training with sent me a text message and said, if I send you a picture, can you tell me if it's asbestos? My immediate response is, no, that's not how it works. But what had happened is they were doing some work in a property and it involved going under the floorboards. And they lifted the floorboards and that was what they saw. Unfortunately, they sent me the picture after they'd gone through it with the reciprocating saw. Because when they did send me the picture, I did say, yeah, that's pretty certainly asbestos. Um, but at this point, it's a little bit late. So the discovery of asbestos during refurbishment or construction works is not something that's unusual. It should be planned for. Asbestos surveying is not based around a kind of guarantee. We will not, as asbestos surveyors, find all asbestos in buildings because it was never put in for that purpose. It was never put in to be found and removed and replaced. And it does end up in some strange places. And this is the reason I chose this picture is it's a particularly good one because the surveyor who carried out the asbestos survey for this premise had lifted floorboards up, just not the specific floorboards where this pipe ran. So therefore, the surveyor hadn't found that pipe run. But again, the contractor should really have stopped before they decide to start contacting myself. So continuing moving forward. So asbestos management is ongoing, it is cyclical. Those of you involved in health and safety will appreciate the deeming cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. And I find myself using this more and more with all aspects of what I do, whether it's creation of training courses or discussion and consultancy. But it's like, what are we trying to achieve? So the planning aspect, we know what it is that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve effective asbestos management. So that comes with starting off with a survey, agreeing what the survey is going to look at, any exclusions or limitations. The doing relies on us to read the survey. And I know that it's not intended to be patronizing. However, it's important that we understand any limitations. Going back to the point that I made on the previous slide, did the surveyor go under the floorboards? Did the surveyor access the cupboards? Did they get everywhere I expected them to? If they didn't, then I need to almost get them back to site to deal with what they originally should have completed. So importance of checking the survey and reviewing it. Is it adequate? Is it fit for the purpose we need? And we can run this through if we're doing planned works, if we're doing refurb works. So do we need an additional survey or was the original survey suitable and sufficient? Do we need to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more intrusive into the buildings? And that again, it would depend largely on the project and then act upon it. Once we've found all of the asbestos, we carry out the risk assessment, we prioritize the action plan for asbestos, and then we can start again. What's the next 12 months looking like? Because every year the asbestos management plan should be reviewed. It should also be reviewed if a building's occupancy changes. So if the people in the building change, if the use of the building, or even if the use of a specific area of the building changes. And again, it's something that we need to be aware of because advancements in technology and machinery don't necessarily follow suit that the buildings are being adapted at the same time. So if we change the machinery in there, that may have an impact on how asbestos disturbance may arise. And following an asbestos incident, so if something goes wrong and it results in asbestos being disturbed, it should automatically trigger a review of the management plan because is it something we could reasonably have foreseen or has a bus just fallen out of the sky onto the roof of one of our properties and we could never have foreseen that? But we should review this point. And again, that's the sort of closing point on how asbestos management should look is let's keep on top of this. Let's not just set our stall out. Let's not spend all the effort in creating these very nice documents, but then they never get reviewed. And I think this is why we seem to have evolved into the let's inspect our asbestos annually, because it almost ties in with this. But again, sometimes annually may not be enough. Sometimes it will be too frequent. So just to summarize, my timings are okay on this one. So wherever we have asbestos, we need to communicate with people, whether that's employees, contractors, or anybody else that needs to know. There's this reluctance that we have sometimes to discuss asbestos openly. And it's again, it's a personal, I suppose, pet hate of mine where we don't want to talk about asbestos because it is in our buildings. You know, it's in a huge amount of our buildings, and there's a lot of misconceptions and there's a lot of misinformation. Yes, asbestos can be problematic, but it can also be managed. And I think the important thing is understanding the importance of dialogue, of educating people about asbestos because of the latency period. What we don't want in 20 to 30 years is no reduction in the number of people dying due to asbestos disease. And I think that's the thing with it now, is like asbestos disease can be prevented if we discuss and we know about asbestos and we educate people about it. And we view it in the same way as we do something, say, for instance, such as electricity, where the vast majority of society doesn't mess with electricity if they're not sure about what they're doing, because the risk of electricity is widely documented. Um, I suppose the big difference is that electricity will cause you harm today, whereas asbestos can cause you harm in 40 years' time. And that's certainly an issue that we're quite aware of today. We're perhaps not as aware of what we're going to be doing in 30 or 40 years' time. So again, detail in the monitoring regime, how we're going to inspect our asbestos. When are we going to do it? Are we going to do it internally? Do we have the competence to do it internally? Do we have the resource to do it internally? Are we going to outsource it? Are we going to bring our third-party consultants back to re-inspect our asbestos floor tiles once every whatever time period it is? Ensuring that training is fit for purpose, ensuring that training is adequate. And again, there's lots of different ways of getting messages across, whether that's face-to-face, virtual, e-learning. And there's a place for all of those sort of methods of delivery. And finally, just controlling the works. There's various ways that we can deal with our asbestos or our buildings generally. Implementation of permitting regimes, permissioning regimes, permits to work, labels, applying labels to asbestos materials. Again, there's a stigma attached to it. So that comes back to the communication point. Personally, I'm not a fan of asbestos labeling. I think it introduces a layer to our asbestos management that doesn't necessarily need to be there, because we've now got to manage not only the asbestos, but the labels that are applied to the asbestos. As I say, I'm never going to say never, but it's not something that I'm a particular fan of. Plans, drawings. Now, I'm much bigger fan of drawings and plans and schematics, because we are, for the most part, visual creatures. So being able to identify where the hazards are. But again, the evolution of technology, things like mobile phones, which everybody tends to have in their pockets now, the evolution of QR codes, the databases that exist now. I think we're in a position where asbestos management doesn't need to be this grey area. It doesn't need to be this murky water where people aren't confident what it is that they're doing, or aren't confident in the effectiveness of their asbestos management. And it comes back to a point that I will frequently say, and that is, if I gave you £10,000 today, would you be able to, in 5 minutes, tell me where you were going to spend it to remedy the biggest risk in your organisation from asbestos? And if the answer to that question would be no, then we can do better. And that's where we sort of striving to achieve. And that being said, almost timed it perfect for the 45 minutes that I wanted to. So are there any questions? Are you back in? I'm looking at the chat, the questions on the chat.
Thank you, Matt, for that very informative session. There are no questions in the chat at the moment, so we do have a number of participants still with us. So anybody that's there, do you have any questions at all? Thank you, Frank, for your comment there about the awareness session. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions at all about the session that Matt's just delivered for us around asbestos management and asbestos management plans?
So the slides are going to be available. I did say that question. I think you've answered it there. Yeah, so the slides are going to be available. And if anybody does have any questions moving forward, then feel free to contact me.
Okay. The other thing I'll also ask is, I know we've still got some participants with us, which is great. So
Okay.
outside of what you've heard from today, and I'm sure Matt won't mind me doing this because we've known each other for a long time. So does anybody have any other asbestos questions, specifically outside of management plans or the campaign, that are burning issues to you, perhaps in your organisation, and if there's anything that you want to discuss while we've just got that 15 minutes left that might benefit you. Thank you, Claire, for your comments, and Ray as well. Obviously, Julie has,
And
I
another
think,
frame.
commented that it will be available on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch it and rewatch the slides, then that'll be there. I will arrange for Julie to make those slides available to those of you who have asked for those. Just keep going around. Any questions? Okay, a question, Matt, for you there.
There
There
used
used
to
to
be
be
a
a register
register.
of old products that was a useful reference. Blimey. That's a while ago, I think, isn't it? Is that still available? Do you know? Come on, you Mr. Geeky, you'll know that answer.
So there's a few bits and pieces that float around every now and again. So there's a list of old sort of gas heaters, storage heaters, boilers that contained asbestos. There's also, I think, detailed in both 264 and 248, if I'm not mistaken, a list of asbestos products. So, for instance, asbestos insulating board. Yeah, so the TUC was that's the document that is actually still used by BOHS when it comes to part of the syllabus for the 405. I'm trying to think who wrote it. It might have been Thomas. It was something like Thomas Telford or that sort of area. Um, but yeah, a lot of that was extrapolated with 264. The document still exists, and it is it's DETR. I think it's the DETR document for asbestos, and it still floats around. It's not been revised, but it is still in existence, and it is still used as part of the syllabus for BOHS. Um, the more recent iteration with 264, it gives you a list of the products, and then it'll say, for instance, the trade names of those products. So, for instance, it'll say asbestos insulating board, and then the trade name will be like Turn Asbestos, Asbestolux, Kate boards, etc. And then it goes through the percentages, things like that. But yeah, the DETR document is still floating around. Yeah.
We do have a question in the Q&A box now, Matt, if you don't mind, from Aaron. One of the asbestos contractors insists on reassessing every 12 months. What would you recommend the review period be? And I know we've talked about that a little bit in terms of that risk-based approach, if you like, to asbestos management. So do you want to sort of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's another one popped up there as well from Ray. So
There is, yes, around inspections as well, and detailed
12,
inspections. So do you want
12
to pick
months.
up both of those for us, if you
Yeah,
will?
I'll start with Aaron's question about the asbestos consultants, contractors. That's not unusual, Aaron. It's fairly commonplace. What would I recommend the review period be? Well, I'm going to slope my shoulders on that one and say it would depend on what your risk assessment says. We've evolved in the UK over 20 years to just do this annual reinspection. And a lot of the time, we're doing it without any understanding of why we're doing it. Now, I've got no problems with you as the client doing the 12 monthly re-inspections, as long as you appreciate why you're doing it. But it's when I say to people, why do you do 12 monthly re-inspections? And they go, I don't know. And it's the same with consultants, if I'm honest with you. If you look at that paragraph that I highlighted, it's paragraph 144 of of L143. And that's the bit that says periodically. And it should be based on your risk assessment. I suppose the easiest answer is because a lot of clients historically haven't completed that risk assessment, there's been no other benchmark to set when we should be inspecting. So there was one client that I worked with. I won't go into too many sort of soliloquies or memoirs. And they actually had an item in their building, and it was a theatre curtain that went up and down every show in an auditorium with 1,400 people. When they carried out their risk assessment, that item needed inspecting twice a day. When it came down, just before it went back up. That was the completion of risk assessment. But then when they came to spend money, guess which item was the first one they prioritized? It was that one that needed inspecting. But the recommendation from the consultant would have been to inspect it annually because they don't necessarily appreciate what goes on in your building. Um, so again, the recommendation of a consultant, plus, call me a cynic, but if they're charging you every 12 months, why would I want to extend that any frequent, any further apart? So hopefully that sort of clarifies that point. And right, so clarification. Is it okay that our site staff carry out periodic monthly inspections of asbestos? Do we need a specialist to carry out a detailed inspection? So again, what are we looking for when we do a re-inspection? We're looking for a change in the material. Now, I am going to kind of caveat this with, don't personally, I wouldn't expect people to go and have a look at sprayed coatings and laggings simply because they can be a bit more unpleasant. But if I'm going to send my staff around to go and check some floor tiles haven't deteriorated or the bathroom walls not had a hole put in it, yeah, absolutely, you could carry out site staff do that. You see it a lot with schools actually now where they will coach their site managers, caretakers, whatever the term would be used, to do termly inspections on their sort of main located asbestos. So it's absolutely fine to do that. And again, it's what we're looking for. We're looking for a material change in the material in the asbestos. Has it been damaged? Do we need a specialist to carry out a detailed inspection on an annual basis? Absolutely not. A lot of people like the comfort blanket of having a third party, but there's absolutely nothing in the legal side of things that says you must use a UCAS accredited party to do the re-inspections. You need to use somebody competent to do the re-inspections. But then what is competence? Can you identify that something has become damaged in a period of time? There's lots of pro formas that sort of exist, or you could create your own pro forma. I've worked with organisations to create pro formas for specifically that reason, whereby you pre-populate the data, the site staff go out, take a new photo of the item, write a few sort of lines down, and that then ends up into the asbestos register, and it's cyclical. Personally, my preference is to have something that's in your control. So that if, for instance, if we are talking about re-inspecting things every day, like in the theatre that I was talking about, that was done by the front of house or the back of house manager. It was curtain came down, no change, signed off the sheet, and just before the curtain went back up 3 hours later, they do exactly the same thing. So I hope that
Well,
answers both of those questions.
thank you, Matt. Before we round off today, I'm just going to pinch the opportunity, if that's okay, to mention that IIRSM Scotland branch committee has a event on the 3rd of July. Is virtual, just to come along and meet us all. We've got some new guys joining us, which I'm really excited about. We've got the branch survey to discuss, and we'll sort of give you an update of the focus of how the branch is going to move forward and some of the plans that we've got for the rest of the year. So have a look out for the invite for the 3rd of July, and please do come along and take the opportunity to have a chat with us and find out a bit more about the committee and what we've got coming for you. So I'm just going to talk about that, and then we do have another question in there from Anonymous, which is absolutely fine. So where do you find a single database of competent asbestos surveyors? There's a good question. Is there one? We know there's the license database. I'm not sure whether there's anything like that at all, Matt. Is there anything you've come across there?
No. So essentially, HSE deal with the licensing regime, so their database of licensed contracts is actually quite interesting because it's not housed on the HSE's website, it's on the CONIAC website, which is the Construction Industry Advisory Committee. In terms of consultancies, as I say, we don't have to be licensed as consultants, but it is recommended that we are accredited. Now, if you wanted to find an accredited organisation, you'd go onto the UCAS website, which is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. That means that the organisations have been vetted, checked, the surveyors should be competent, there should be control mechanisms, there should be quality management systems, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that they're infallible? Absolutely not. There's plenty of UCAS accredited surveyors that have missed asbestos or, been perhaps poor in terms of the standards. but they're likewise with any activity, construction, asbestos removal, but there isn't a register per se. The two accreditation standards, just for those that are interested, ISO standard 17025 is the accreditation standard for analysing samples and analysing asbestos. You actually have to have that one to do those activities. The accreditation standard for asbestos surveying, which is the inspection aspect of it, is 17020 or 17020. And that's the one that at this moment in time is not a legal requirement, but it is a strong recommendation. You could find the list of organisations that hold those accreditations on the UCAS database. But I don't think you can spit the whole database out. I think you just have to search via industry or accreditation.
Well, thank you. I hope that answers the question for you. Before we round off for the session, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and just give you one final chance if there's any questions, any further questions or any other information that you'd like from Matt while we've still got him. If not, like I say, thank you very much. The slides will be available. Julie will have those and send those out for who's asked. And if you wanted to watch a rerun and review some of the responses that Matt's given, then please head over to the YouTube channel where you'll be able to see the session again. That's brilliant. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good evening.